Let me ask you a question. What is the right way to react to bad news? Strange question, right? But it probably depends on the news. But it seems that the response of my thoughts and prayers are with you is the default these days. Because most of the time, that's about all we can do. In 2015, there was yet another mass shooting in California. There was an outpouring of people with thoughts and prayers messages, because it's hard to know what to say in the middle of a national tragedy. But New York's daily newspaper noticed that many politicians had posted this sentiment. Thoughts and prayers are with those affected and their families. And the next day they led with the headline, "God isn't fixing this." So for politicians to pour out their thoughts and prayers was not enough as far as that newspaper was concerned. Politicians had the opportunity to fix things, and the Daily News didn't see that happening. It's like they were crying out, how long do we need to hear of mass murder before someone will do something about it? And of course, we all have our own exasperations. How long until we get a baby? How long before they'll change that stretch of road so no one else gets killed? How long will I have to suffer like this? How long till I have money so that I can feed my kids again? These are all desperate cries for help. And as you well know, often the things that we're waiting for seem to take the longest time to come. Maybe you're waiting for a vaccine so you can get your life back to normal. Maybe you're waiting to see a friend that you've been unable to see. And those are good things to look forward to. But if they didn't happen, you'd learn to cope. We have learned to cope. This is us coping. But what about when all hope is gone? And anyone who's suffered from depression will know this. How long am I going to feel like this? And as is often the case, that feeling gets so overwhelming to the point where many sufferers of depression see no way out but to take their own lives. It's desperate. See, that phrase, how long, is a cry of desperation. Psalm 13 is a psalm attributed to David, as many are, but it's hard to pinpoint a specific time in David's life that relates to. But there's no reason to think that it wasn't a repeated event, that this would be a lament that David would continually come back to. How long, O Lord? How long will Saul pursue me? How long will the Philistines threaten your people? How long will I carry this guilt? But maybe, though, it's something much more than even those things, because this psalm smacks of absolute desperation and exhaustion, that the powers of endurance have been thoroughly spent. There is nothing left in the emotional tank. It starts off, how long, O Lord? Will you forget me forever? And it's important to remember that this is not a theological treatise. It's not telling us that God forgets people. We can't take from this psalm that God forgets about people, but this is poetry. It's a psalmist expressing a feeling or an emotion. I don't think it's even a question. It's an expression of feeling. The psalmist is unable to cope with the current circumstances. For him to cry out because God is not intimate with him tells us that he definitely knew intimacy with God in order for him to notice when it wasn't there. So the lack of intimacy with God is enough to make him cry out in desperation. But it also so happens that the psalmist is suffering from, I think, at worst, depression, and at best, thoroughly miserable. Verse 2 says, how long? How must I have sorrow in my heart all the day? That's a superlative, right? Sorrow in my heart all the day. And either one of these things, the separation from his loving God or the sorrow in his heart all the day is enough to make him cry out in desperation. So let's just throw in an enemy as well, just to make it really, really bad. How long will my enemy be exalted over me? And we're not sure, maybe that's a physical or an emotional or a spiritual enemy, maybe all of the above, but definitely seems to be at least a physical enemy. So imagine the worst time of your life and triple it. Now, I'm not trying to be trite here, and maybe you've been in a similar situation where your whole world has fallen apart around you. Let's be clear, for the psalmist, this isn't a bad day. It's a prolonged period of absolute desperation. And for many of us, it's going to be hard to fully imagine what the psalmist is really feeling. And if that is the case, then we can count ourselves fortunate. But one of the interesting things about this psalm is that the psalmist who feels abandoned by God turns to God. Get this, he feels like God's abandoned him, but he has not abandoned God. Isn't it usually the other way around? And I think at this point, David has recognized there is literally nothing that he can do to redeem himself. And by extension, the people of God for a few thousand years since have recognized that there's nothing that we can do to redeem ourselves. Verse 3, consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Like, take your time, but make it good. Why wouldn't a loving God relieve the psalmist of his anguish? Why does God take his time to heal? Why does God take time to show himself? When I was in seminary, my New Testament prof told us a story. I think he was working as a missionary at the time. And he said that he'd spent years, many years, most of his life in absolute pain. And he would wake up each morning and pray that this was his last. Now, elders of the church, I think it was in Southeast Asia somewhere, elders of the church prayed over him, like many other elders of many other churches had done before. But at this time, God chose to heal him. And while a miraculous healing is amazing, the thing about the whole story that amazed me was when he said he wouldn't change any of his suffering because of who it made him and his reliance on God for strength on a daily basis. Wouldn't change the pain every morning to wish that this was his last day. Wouldn't change it because it made him rely on God on a daily basis for strength. And I think that's kind of how the psalmist feels. It says, light up my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death. If you don't do this, God, let this day be my last. Or maybe this is all too much and it's going to kill me. Or maybe that's the role of the enemy here. Verse 4, lest my enemy say I have prevailed over him. Light up my eyes, lest my enemy will say that he's prevailed over me. The psalmist has put himself in the hands of God. Either God fixes things or he dies. Either God comes through for him or what's the point? And that's the turning point of the psalm. Verse 5, we've got that contrasting word, but I have trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. From the pit of despair, the psalmist is now talking about rejoicing. That's a big leap. It's like he's recognized something of hope. That small amount of hope has blossomed. Like he's been here before, and God came through before. And if God did it then, he'll do it now. It's like he's saying, this is the pits, but I know you've got something better for me, God. How do I know? Because you've done it before. So while my brain is saying, this is the end, my heart can rejoice in the redemption that you will inevitably bring. And then remembering that this is a song the psalmist can sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. See, God has been generous with him. And if God is unchanging, then what's to think that he wouldn't do the same again? In fact, that's the only hope that the psalmist has. That through the bounty of the goodness of God, he will redeem the situation, that he will redeem his life. But we have to notice where he puts his hope. It's not in his kingship or his power or his military prowess. It's in his God. What we don't know about this psalm is a time frame between those initial feelings and a final rejoicing. This could be the psalmist remembering a time when he felt this way, and he was looking back at the entire event. Or it could be the psalmist rapidly going through the motions of despair and then remembering the goodness of God. Or it could be that the psalmist spent 20 years in despair, but then God came through for him. We don't know, and that's one of the things that's wonderful about psalms like this. So does God abandon his people? Well, David would have been well aware of the law and how God describes himself to Moses as the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. See, there's the salvation, the love, the faithfulness, and the forgiveness, the things that pull the psalmist out of despair and to a point of rejoicing. But I don't think that's normal, unfortunately. At least not in a short time frame. Not in a time frame that we'd like, which is immediately. It's God, I don't want to suffer. I don't care what you want to teach me. Teach me anything that doesn't involve suffering. Paul had a very similar experience that we have recorded in 2 Corinthians. He talks of a thorn in his flesh that was given to him, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong. And many of you, that's a familiar passage, but when you're reading that, you should say, I'm sorry, what, Paul? Because here's me praying, teach me anything you want, but with little to no pain, please. And Paul says, I'm content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecution, and calamities. Why? Because that's when he lets go. And that's when he lets God take over. In our weakness, God is strong. See, in difficult times, we don't usually look introspectively. When a psalm teaches us to look outside ourselves for help, we often look inside. Psalm 121, familiar psalm to many of you. I look to the mountains. Where does my help come from? The psalmist answers his own question. My help comes from the Lord. So just to be clear, here's what I'm not saying this morning. I am not saying if you're suffering, it's because you're not relying on God enough, or that God causes suffering to make us rely on him. What I am saying is that when suffering, when exhaustion, when depression, when persecution hits, despite the physical limitations in those times, spiritually, we can lean into God because he is enough. He is our salvation. It doesn't mean anything is going to be easy. Nobody said following Jesus was going to be easy. Not in the least bit. But if you're searching for a glimmer of hope, that's where you'll find it. Let me ask you this. How are you doing? Last time I spoke was just after Christmas, after the tree comes down was the theme. We talked about Blue Monday, we talked about COVID, we talked about winter, and we talked about finding light in the middle of the darkness. But there's no shortcut for this. Sometimes the darkness is overbearing, but it's temporary. God promises us that. His grace is sufficient. He has set us aside for glory. Now, that's often not enough in the moment, but it is the promise that it won't be like this forever. It's hope, and it's the expectation that, like the psalmist, because God has come through before, he will do it again. Amen.